As a journalist from Canada, it was really surprising for me to see the lack of coverage on the events that happened on February the 8th and what reporters call the Fishball Revolution. So, for those of us who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about what happened that night?
Sure. So, as some of your listeners may know, February 8th was a Chinese New Year holiday. And in Hong Kong, it's sort of become traditional for street vendors to sell food during the holidays, which is technically illegal as they don't have the proper health permits to do that. This year, the Hong Kong authorities decided they weren't going to allow this to happen. And it upset some local groups, notably Hong Kong indigenous, who basically threw their support behind the street vendors, saying they had no other way to make a living. And they accompanied the street vendors to confront the police who were trying to prevent them from selling their wares. And what ended up happening was violent confrontations between the protesters and the police. The Hong Kong government has said that 90 police were injured from having bricks thrown at them and being beaten by protesters. The protesters have said that the police were also beating protesters, using pepper spray and tear gas against them. And most controversially, one Hong Kong policeman fired 2 warning shots with his gun into the air, which seemed to really incite a wave of violence from the protesters. So after this happened, the Hong Kong government declared it a riot. It called the protesters mobs, and they have actually arrested over 70 of the people who were involved in the protests or allegedly involved in the protests and are planning on pressing charges for inciting violence. There have also been counter-accusations that the police need to be investigated for being overly violent. It was really kind of a surprising explosion of violence in Hong Kong at a time when a lot of people had more or less thought things had settled down.
So, what do you think sparked all this? Was it simply the protesters wanting to protect these vendors, or was there something more behind all this?
I think it's pretty clear that there are deeper motivations at play. What sparked this particular incident was the street vendor protests, but there have been these sort of eruptions of violent tendencies sporadically since the Occupy movement in 2014. There's a lot of anger, I think, among certain sectors of Hong Kong society, a lot of fear that their culture, their way of life is being taken over by mainland China, that the freedoms and particularly the form of government that they've enjoyed are being taken over. They've becoming Sinified, that Beijing is having more control. And I think a lot of protesters from the Occupy Central movement sort of split into 2 camps. Some of them continue to believe peaceful protest is the way to go. They're actually trying to win seats in the government. There's another camp, however, that thinks, okay, our Occupy peaceful protests failed, so we're going to need to do something more drastic if we want to truly save our society and change the current trajectory where mainland China will just take us over completely. These people have actually called themselves rebels, which is obviously a much more loaded term than protester. So it's this sort of thinking that was behind these current protests, and the people who are part of some of these localist movements, as they're called, I think are more primed to respond with violence when they're met with opposition from the police, because there's a high level of distrust of the police and the current Hong Kong government already.
So, what are these people? What are these protesters fighting for? Are they simply fighting for the leader Leung Cheng-ying to leave the office, or are they fighting for something deeper than that, beyond that?
Well, this isn't really a unified movement. I think it's important to point that out. There's lots of different groups and people with different motivations. Some people, as you say, want Xu Huailiang to leave. People have been calling for that for years. He's not a very popular leader. There are other groups that have outright said that they want Hong Kong to separate from China and become its own country, sort of along the lines of Singapore as a city-state. And then there are people in between who say they just want their local government to do more to stand up to Beijing when Beijing seems to be interfering in Hong Kong's local governance. And most recently, the issue that has gotten a lot of media attention has been the supposed abduction of these 5 booksellers from Hong Kong who are affiliated with publishing and selling books that have all these juicy, gossipy stories about the mainland Chinese leadership. These 5 men just vanished from Hong Kong in early January, and now they've all appeared in China. They've made remarks on Chinese TV saying they went voluntarily, that they've been charged with crimes, they've confessed to those crimes. Most people aren't buying that. Most people are thinking, okay, it looks suspicious that all 5 of these people voluntarily went to China within a few weeks. And that has a lot of people concerned about what that means for legal process in Hong Kong, about what that means for Chinese censorship in Hong Kong. So I think that's kind of a much more nebulous goal, is to say we don't want our freedoms eroded by China. And I don't know if there's really a single aim that they have in terms of addressing that fear.
So China has long touted this one country, two system method. Do you think that method will work?
It depends who you ask. Beijing says that it is working and that it's working fine. The people in Hong Kong who are not comfortable with the current trajectory of their special administrative region think that it's just kind of a facade, that China says one country, two systems, but it's moving toward one country, one system. That Beijing's ultimate goal is to change Hong Kong's system into the Chinese system. And the Hong Kong University does all sorts of public opinion polls, and one of their polls is how confident people are in one country, two systems, how they think it's going, more or less. And it's pretty consistently been a close to 50-50 split, with the majority swinging back and forth between people saying, yes, I have confidence in the system, and people saying, no, I don't, which I think is a pretty fair reflection of the general mood in Hong Kong at this point.
Wasn't there also a study that said that the Hong Kong people were more reluctant to relate to the Chinese people? They were more they wanted to term themselves Hong Kong people as opposed to Chinese people?
Yes, that was another poll that Hong Kong University has done, and they've done this for years. So it's really interesting to compare their data. I think right now it's around 40% of people identify themselves as only a Hong Konger, as opposed to Chinese or Chinese Hong Konger, or some combination of the two. Before 2010, it was less than 25% of people who identify themselves solely as Hong Konger. So that's a pretty substantial change in only 5 years. I think part of the problem is that the younger generation feels most strongly that we are from Hong Kong. We are not Chinese, and we don't want to be identified as Chinese. So this is going to be a long-term challenge for China to address, and I think the numbers of people identifying as Hong Konger are only going to go up as the younger generation kind of starts to come into leadership positions.
Myself, having lived in Hong Kong and coming from a Hong Kong family, is it fair for me to say that it's an old school versus new school mentality where the older generation wants stability and the newer generation want democracy?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Obviously, there's going to be exceptions, and you can't paint with a broad brush. But most of what we're seeing are young people protesting, particularly student groups. They were very active in organizing the Occupy protests, and it was mostly student groups who came down on the side of the protesters in the recent Fishball Revolution. And on the other side of things, you have the established figures in government, in the business community, and obviously they're older, right, because they've established themselves as authority figures in their respective fields. And they are the ones saying things are fine. The problem is with all of these young people who are stirring up trouble and trying to destroy Hong Kong. But I'm sure there are older people who also feel that they're worried about the fate of their city. There's also younger people who probably think that things are getting out of hand.
So if they're really trying to go for democracy, do you personally think that violence can achieve this democracy, or can it only be achieved through political means?
That's a very loaded question. In the case of Hong Kong, It's tough to see any path to democracy actually working. That's a very pessimistic answer, but it's so crucial for the central government in Beijing to maintain tight control over Hong Kong. There's not really a viable path, I don't think, for them to realize their goal of being able to directly elect any candidate who has popular support. The reason that a lot of these sentiments broke out, to give your listeners some background, in 2014, the mainland government came out with a proposal for Hong Kong's constitutional reform so that they could directly elect their chief executive, which is the top leader in Hong Kong. Yep. The problem was that Beijing said those candidates had a very high bar to pass to be actually nominated to be able to run. And that would basically exclude anyone who wasn't very close to the central government in China from running, who didn't have central government's approval. They would just not be able to be candidates at all. So a lot of people felt, well, this isn't a real democracy. One of the metaphors was, you're asking us to choose between Coke, Diet Coke. That's not a real choice. Yeah. So that was the birth of the Occupy Central protest, where you had thousands of people on the street saying, we want real democracy. And the Chinese government flat out said, no, we're not changing. We're not giving you what you want. And the protest more or less fizzled out after a couple of months without any concessions from Beijing. Now, the Hong Kong legislature was able to block the proposal. So instead of having direct elections under Beijing's terms, they have the current system, which is not direct elections. The chief executive is chosen by a council of around 600 people who are mostly handpicked by Beijing. So I think Beijing has made it very clear it's not going to compromise on this, and that's why you're seeing this violence, because a lot of people have more or less given up hope that their peaceful protests can achieve their goals. The problem with using violence is that it sort of gives both the Hong Kong government and the central government, if it comes to that, an excuse to move in and use force to quell this movement. Exactly. In a way that peaceful protests wouldn't.
Exactly. So you bring about that point where the central government might have to bring in their own forces. So what do you have to say about the people or reporters who compare this to the events of Tiananmen Square?
I think it is a risk, but I wouldn't say it's especially likely at this point. The Hong Kong police have been, especially from an American perspective, I'm sure everyone around the world knows our issues with police violence. From an American perspective, the Hong Kong police have been pretty restrained. They've used tear gas and pepper spray and kind of the low-tier coercion measures to disperse the protesters. And that seems to be working so far. The reason that the Fishball Revolution was notable in my mind was that you really had a lot of people engaging violently in response to police trying to disperse them. People picking up bricks from the street and throwing them at the police, people hitting and punching the police, people setting fires on the street. It was fairly small scale compared to the Occupy protests. We're talking, a couple hundred people rather than thousands. But if you can imagine a circumstance where you have a protest on the scale of the Occupy Central and it turns violent in the way that the Fishball Revolution protested, I think you might see the Chinese government actually move in. They have troops already stationed in Hong Kong, and they might be tempted to use them.
Exactly. So if they're getting violent, like right now, what do you think is going to happen in the future, like during election times?
That is an excellent question. Certainly they don't think that their protests and concerns are being addressed through the actual government. I think the bigger question is, what does Hong Kong society at large think about these protests? How widespread are these sentiments? How many people would support sort of this violence on a continued measure? And I think most people aren't in favor of it. No one's actually asked in a survey, to my knowledge, do you support violent protests as a way of advancing Hong Kong cause? But certainly most of the major protest leaders, including Joshua Wong, who was one of the main Occupy Central leaders, They have said, the police shouldn't have used violence, but they've also denounced the violence by the protesters. And the sort of mainstream protest camp is looking more at, well, maybe we can win some elections, get some seats on the legislative council. And then they're being attacked by these fringe groups who think they're not doing enough.
So essentially, these violent protests are hurting the people who are trying to fight for democracy through these political means.
Yes, I would say that's accurate. It's fracturing the opposition for one thing. When you had the Occupy Central movement, basically all of these different forces were coming together and working together. And the longer that went without a successful resolution, the more fractured and splintered these groups became, and the more they started thinking, well, let's use alternative means to achieve our ends. And now you have these violent protesters whose goals sound fairly similar to people who might be running for a legislative council seat, and it's easy for the opposition, the political opposition to these groups, to paint them all with the same brush and kind of scare people away from voting for these young candidates.
So let's bring it back to our side of the world. Why do you think it is that the Western media didn't really cover this issue, like it wasn't in the headlines or anything?
One expert on Hong Kong, based here in D.C., told me that people don't pay any attention to Hong Kong in general, except for the Occupy Central protests. So it really takes a very enormous event to attract the world's attention to what's going on over there. They're kind of a forgotten region of the world in a lot of ways. For people who follow China, it definitely was in the headlines, but it disappeared fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is because there's not an easy narrative to grasp. There's not a hero, there's not a villain. It seems like such a small incident, right? Street vendors being not allowed to sell fish balls on the street. But there's so many complex motivations behind it that it's hard to really convey accurately in a news story. Whereas the Occupy Central protest was very easy. These people are protesting for democracy, and a very catchy narrative there. I think it's just a harder story to convey in a region that tends to have its stories go overlooked, and so it got overlooked.
So would it be fair to say that the people in the Fishball Revolution are the same as the umbrella soldiers of Occupy Central?
Probably largely yes. A lot of the people, the Hong Kong indigenous was kind of tabbed as the leader, and that's a group that was formed in the aftermath of Occupy Central. So I think you're seeing a lot of the same motivations at play, a lot of the same groups who were in both, but again, there's pretty serious difference in what they're actually doing and how they're trying to achieve their goals.
Okay, thank you so much, Shannon. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to me.